Welcome to the New Life Ministries podcast. Have you ever wished, if only this thing hadn't happened, then this other thing would have gone better? Of course, we've all had moments like that. But have you then wrestled to trust the Lord while having that thought? I want to trust the Lord, but this painful thing didn't really need to have happened. Why did he not do something? This was similar to Mary and Martha's experience in John 11. But their experience was part of a greater lesson, something Jesus wanted them to discover. Let's join Curtis as he looks at the story of bringing Lazarus back to life.
So good morning, folks. Today we're going to look at John chapter 11. John chapter 11. And for those of you listening online, welcome to you. Have you ever said the phrase, if only, and then caught yourself and tried to align that with trusting God? So you know that line, if only, right? If only things had gone different, then things would have turned out better. If only you had been here when I brought the groceries home, then the dog would not have escaped. If only I had waited a little longer, then I wouldn't have missed you. If only this had happened, then that other thing would have been much better. And it's easy how, even though we don't intend it, that little phrase can sound like blame, eh? If only you had been... And you might only have been expressing a thought, but it can just sound a little bit like blame. But as for Christians, we also want to live trusting Jesus and trusting that he has his hand involved in our story. And so we can run into this tension. If only we had caught the diagnosis early, he would still be with us today. But I trust God with what has happened. If only I had kept my mouth shut, I wouldn't have lost my job. But maybe God has a plan for what has happened. Trusting God through what has happened is good, especially if you've been faithful to following Jesus. You know, we want to trust God with what is happening. But that doesn't mean there isn't at times just a little tension in what we experience. I trust, but it's hard to trust, and if only. So let's look at John chapter 11. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you're going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they will see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." I'm kind of curious how he would have said that line. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Mary and Martha to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and asking for you." When Mary heard this, she quickly got up and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in her house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to go to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of a blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad smell, for he has been there for 4 days." And then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. We'll stop there. If only you had been here, then Lazarus would not have died. There's a lot in this text that we could look at, but there is a main lesson, an overarching lesson through this whole passage. Jesus is developing and strengthening belief in his disciples. He is growing their faith. He's expanding their understanding of who he is. He is expanding their understanding of who they are believing in by showing that he is stronger than death. But let's start at the beginning. Here are some things to notice that show this is about developing the faith in his disciples. Jesus is given news that his friend Lazarus is sick. Verse 4, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." So through this incident, the truth and beauty in Jesus is going to be revealed, or a new truth and beauty in Jesus is going to be revealed. He stays where he is for 2 more days. He waits. Do you know that experience of waiting for God to act and waiting, and how it tests our faith? Then he says to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." And if you recall back in chapter 10 last week, the leaders in Jerusalem last week had gathered around him and were going to stone him. And in fact, the people in Jerusalem were not particularly receptive to Jesus and his message. And now they're going to go back to that area. This is going to be risky, which is why Thomas says, "Let us also go that we may die with him." They knew there was a threat where Jesus intended to go. They knew there would be a threat on their life where Jesus intended to go if they were going to follow him. Therefore, it's really neat that Jesus says anybody who walks by day will not stumble. He's calling them to trust. You are safer when you walk with me, follow me, rather than when you don't walk with me. Verse 14 says, "So then he told them plainly, 'Lazarus is dead. And for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.'" Jesus is making it very clear. Lazarus' death is going to help you believe. It's going to expand your belief. By understanding this story, understanding the story, it's going to help and it's going to deepen our belief. Which character in the story do you see the story through? Through whose eyes? If you were to look at the story through the eyes of Lazarus, what would you find? Well, Lazarus actually was not present for most of it. So when the whole story is over, Lazarus might conclude, "Phew, I avoided death." And that would be his lesson. If you think about the experience of the story, if you think about the story through the experience of the people who have gathered, most of whom have come from Jerusalem and do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah, what might they experience? What might be their conclusion from the story? Well, some of them may have thought, well, if Jesus had been here on time, we could have avoided all this. And perhaps for some of them, they may have seen that miracle as coming out of nowhere, which is impressive, but it wasn't deepening their faith. But as disciples ourselves, we look at the story and look at it through the eyes of Jesus developing the faith in his disciples. So we are watching disciples in a situation where their lives will be at risk if they follow Jesus. And we're watching disciples who are hurting, who are saying to Jesus, if only you had been here, then this bad thing could have been stopped. This is the group that's about to have their belief in Jesus strengthened by discovering something new about him. What is the thing they discover? They discover that Jesus is more powerful than death. When he says that he is the resurrection and the life, it means he is stronger than death. And then he proves it by calling Lazarus back to life. As I write this talk, on the news it's just been announced that Queen Elizabeth II has passed away. I admire Queen Elizabeth. I honor her. Her funeral service will likely happen close to the time that you hear this message. The news feeds are already full of comments about her life and her legacy. They're full of stories about the experiences she has led through, some of her successes and some of her hardships. And of course, there's many photo collections. This is what she looked like throughout the years. I don't know if I want that at my funeral. This is what he looked like throughout the years. The awareness that death is coming can create subtle drives within us. A drive that sets our agenda and our values and our outlooks. For some people, the awareness that we are finite drives them to have a perspective that says, I will get as much as I can out of this life. I will have many experiences. I will discover, I will consume, I will get the most I can. What happens to that person when something interrupts their quest? Well, they can become frustrated. They can become demanding and quite angry. For some people, the awareness that death is coming drives them to want to make a difference while they're alive. I will have an impact and I will leave a legacy on earth. And helping others and contributing to the running of the planet is good. But what happens when that impact doesn't quite work? What happens when the work you've been doing doesn't last, or it doesn't even make that much of a difference? What might happen to your heart? You might start to build resentment or bitterness, anger, maybe something else. For some people, knowing that life is finite and then evaluating what they're experiencing, they take an attitude of, well, I guess this is all I get out of life. And they sort of press down any anger and develop a certain type of self-pity sometimes. Have you considered what you are like to relate with when these subtle motivations and frustrations are present? Just think about what you might be like to relate with. I mention all of this to say the reality of death really does affect our everyday living. And I've not even included the grief we experience and carry around with us when someone we love passes away? What if all of that could be taken away? What if all the things that are driven by the fear of death and the fear of our finiteness, what if it could all be taken away? How then would you live? What choices would you make? How would it free you? Lazarus has died. He's been in the grave for 4 days. In the Mediterranean climate, bodies start to decompose within 4 days. Jesus arrives. Verse 21, Lord, Martha says to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. What she has heard Jesus say and how she has answered is something like a customary sympathy statement. I'm sorry for your loss. One day you'll be united with him in heaven again. It's that kind of statement. To say your brother will rise again, yes, he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day, that's what they believed. It's consolation. But Jesus is intending a deeper reality by the comment. He's trying to build and expand her faith, to develop her belief. And so Jesus leans into it. And Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God who is to come into the world. That statement of faith is equivalent to Peter's confession of faith that we find in the other Gospels. You are the Christ. It's the confession of faith. It's one of the big confessions of faith in the book of John. Jumping forward in the story, Jesus goes to the grave. They open it. He offers a prayer, and then he says in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus comes out. They had no expectation that Jesus could do this. They knew Jesus could heal someone and prevent death. But here, Jesus is bringing somebody back from the dead. In verse 37, the crowd asks, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Well, yeah, he could heal someone. But they had no concept that Jesus could undo death. And so in order to expand their faith, he reveals he is more powerful than death. He has power over death. He is stronger than death. This is Jesus bringing glory to himself by revealing more about who he is. He is stronger than death. I would suggest that for many people, we don't see Jesus as being in control over death. Yes, we might believe that he controls when death happens, but do you think something like, I'll die, and then Jesus will take over again? Jesus helps me now as I live, and then I will die, and I hope that I will experience Jesus' presence as I approach those last days. And then after I die, Jesus will help me again. But somehow that moment of death happens outside of Jesus' power. This story, this moment in history is showing us that no, Jesus is in control over death. You can die, and Jesus has the ability to say, no, you're going to come back and live again. I am the resurrection and I am the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. There's so many thoughts in that line that they almost buzz confusingly in the mind. It's just not how we think about death. Jesus is more powerful than death. Did you notice the prayer he offered? He didn't ask God the Father to raise Lazarus from the dead. He didn't say, Father, please bring Lazarus back to life. Instead, he says, thank you for hearing me. And I knew you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, so that they would believe that you sent me. His words, this prayer is drawing our attention to the ability that Jesus has, the ability that he has, and it's to strengthen our belief by seeing more of what he can do. And you wonder, why did he call Lazarus out by name? Well, that's so that the others didn't come too. Okay, that was dumb. I read that. It just keeps making me laugh. No, just Lazarus. Anyway, Jesus is the resurrection and the life. He is life. Let that take the pressure off how you think about living and how you think about death coming. It's not about what you feel you need to get done or what you need to experience or how you're going to make a difference or what you didn't get to experience, because that's often it, right? You can let it go. You can also let go of those feelings that get stirred up when your plans get frustrated. If you are a disciple, your life doesn't really end. It doesn't mean you don't make plans and have desires. It doesn't mean you don't try stuff and fight for justice. But you can release the pressure within yourself if it doesn't happen in the next couple decades. Jesus is more powerful than death. But let me offer this one more piece. It's in verse 33 to 35. When Jesus saw Mary weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, those would be people who didn't believe in him, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. The words of that phrase, deeply moved in spirit and troubled, isn't his heart went out to them, he grieved for them. It's he was angry. He was outraged. He was deeply indignant. He was annoyed at what seemed as unfair treatment. Jesus is upset at the pain that death and sin causes. He's angry that his people have to hurt like this. So it's partly focused at what sin has caused people he loves, what the price has been, the resulting pain and the despair. But this is a group that's also so far refused to believe in him, that group that had come from Jerusalem that had been cold towards his message. So he might be angry at the needlessness of the suffering. I am the way out of this, and you refuse to come to me. And Jesus wept. It's a quiet tear. N.T. Wright says of this line, God can cry with the world crying. That's beautiful. This is a God who can cry with the world's crying. So let me summarize. The Lord you believe in is more powerful than death. Let that affect what concerns you when you feel scared or hesitant to follow him as a disciple. Jesus led his disciples back to where people had wanted to stone him. And Thomas says, let us go too, that we may die with him. But Thomas, Jesus is more powerful than death. Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But Martha and Mary, Jesus is the resurrection and the life. He is more powerful than death. The fear of death, our awareness that it is present, can motivate many behaviors that are not always great. It can make us stumble as believers when we are afraid of losing. But what if all of that fear was taken away? What if the fear was gone?
Any thoughts?
That was a great talk. The thoughts that came to my mind was that he didn't just do it here with Lazarus. When Jesus died, there's a passage in the New Testament, I don't remember where it is, but there were a whole whack of people who were raised from the dead. The graves were opened, and they were also raised from the dead. It just showed that God could raise a lot more people than just Jesus. Of course, the most amazing thing was that the person who had died was being raised, or rose, which is, of course, Jesus. Now, it's pretty neat stuff.
I find it intriguing, almost like I would say the math in this story. Because the women, that emotional moment when they're both saying, if you were here, this wouldn't have happened. But earlier in the story, it says, Jesus heard that Lazarus was ill, so he waited where he was 2 days. 2. And when he got there, Lazarus had been dead 4 days. So even if he'd gone, oh my gosh, and rushed, he still would have been late. But then it wouldn't have been obvious that he was making this huge point. So I find that interesting. It's like, okay, so it's good that we pay attention to what point was he actually making, because he wanted to make it super obvious. It's like, I'm not going to be rushed and pushed around by your fear of dying. I'm not going to miss it and be too late. And I'm not worried about the fact that you are pretty sure it's going to smell in there. Like, this is not how this is going to go. I just found that fascinating that he could have gone then and still raised Lazarus from the dead. But he didn't. He gave him 2 more days to marinate in his own juice before he decided to get up and go and make this point and have this conversation with Mary and Martha, with his disciples, with the people that were standing there, and so that it went on record. I find that fascinating, like the math of the problem.
I was thinking about Curtis's question, who do you relate with most in this story? And when Jesus is surrounded by people who are saying, if only, and he is the one that could have done something and is perceived to have not, and all of that, I feel like I identify with that place so much, being a person with lots of responsibilities, and yet, thank God he is God. I also am thinking about the perspective that Curtis was trying to put forward about this question that Jesus is asking Martha, like, do you know who I really am? I keep going back to ideas about our world, our tiny little speck of a planet, and how really tiny we are in this solar system, let alone the rest of the whole universe. It is so hard to get our minds around our size, because if we really think about this, all came out of his breath. That math, that math is very compelling for me. Everything that is not just the speck of planet that we're on, but everything came out of his breath. Then, wow, yes, I guess it totally makes sense that you can do this. So whether it is me worried in my place of expectations, basically, of all those that are looking to me to do something, to not forget who he is, and that, again, he is who he is in the midst of my failings as well as my apparent successes.
Creation, this was Jesus' breath. It was creation. So it's a very personal thing for him, I believe. And, when it talks, in this passage we looked at this morning about Jesus being angry, what I take out of that is that he was angry at what sin and death was doing to his creation. And there is a verse, and I can't remember where it is, that says that Jesus came to defeat death. And, I don't fear death. I'm a little apprehensive about how I might die, but death itself, I'm not, I have no fear of. If God is with us, what have we got to fear?
Let me offer a prayer. Father, this is truly an incredible discovery that we as disciples need to make and let it sink deep. That Jesus is more powerful than death. And the people in the story when this happened had no idea that that was possible. Jesus, I praise you for bringing glory to yourself, for showing us this part of yourself in truth and beauty. And Holy Spirit, I would ask that you would speak to us individually as a group, that you would speak to our heart and show us where we need to let go of fear of death in order to grow as believers, to follow wholeheartedly, and to discover the path you've put in front of us to become more whole as people. You have removed the fear of death. Holy Three in One, we pray this in praise and thanksgiving. You are so good to us. Amen. So I'm going to turn this over to the service leaders. What has caught your attention in Scripture this morning? What has caught your attention, or how has this passage been speaking to you today? Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. New Life Ministries is located in Winnipeg, Manitoba. You are invited to join our service in person or over Zoom. Please use the Contact Us link to send an email to the church office and request the address or Zoom link. If you would like to use these podcasts as part of your home church or local church gathering, you are free to do so. We do request that you let us know. If there is any other way that we can help you in your ministry, please send us an email.